It's great to be here. It's a real pleasure to come and speak to your AGM. I will attempt to be fairly brief so that we've got some time for questions and answers, either on the topic of welfare reform or indeed on anything else that you might want to ask me. I did hear the magic word referendum as I walked into the room there, so you never know, there might be some questions on that as well. Welfare reform is, as I'm sure all of you know from your day-to-day working life, is a big issue just now in Scotland. It's obviously a programme of reform that is being driven by the coalition government in Westminster, but many of the impacts of it are felt here in Scotland. So it's something that occupies the minds of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament quite a lot just now, for reasons that will become obvious as I go through my remarks. I wanted to start really with a very basic, but perhaps point that's not stressed often enough. I don't know anybody, I literally don't know anybody that doesn't think that the welfare system that we have just now needs reformed. It's very complex, it's bureaucratic, it's cumbersome, it's riddled with perverse incentives and downright disincentives to people getting on and getting into work. So there's no disagreement between the Scottish Government and the coalition government that the system is in need of an overhaul. So we're not in any sense saying no to reform. And in fact, I believe that we're at the stage where a pretty fundamental think and look at what a welfare system in any civilised democratic society should look like. I believe very strongly that a decent welfare system is one of the hallmarks of a civilised society, a system that can support people when they are down in the luck and help them pull themselves back up, help them back into work if they've been out of work, a system that provides a safety net for the vulnerable and the sick, a system that provides for people through a national health service as we have, for example. So a welfare system for me is something that we should value as a country. It's become associated in a lot of people's minds, though, as something that is drawn down by people who are somehow not worthy. You know, the language of scanders and scroungers has entered the lexicon, and I think has tainted in the minds of a lot of people what a welfare system worthy of the name actually means. And I'm not saying there are no individuals who abuse the welfare system. Of course there are, and any government should seek to deal with them. But the vast majority of people who depend on social security or depend on the welfare system are people who need that help. And I don't think we should allow it to become tainted with some of the language that we all too regularly hear just now. So although I think there should be reform, I and the government has some deep concerns just now about the impact of some of the particular reforms that are being progressed. Universal credit, which is the main reform that's been introduced, which will replace many of the individual benefits that are paid at the moment, is in theory not a bad thing. The whole principle behind universal credit is that work should always pay. So if you're in benefits and get the chance to go into work, then you should never be worse off, as people can be just now as a result of the current system. That's a good idea. And so that headline benefit change is not necessarily wrong. It's being, in my view, implemented in a pretty cat-handed way. It's quite a big change. There are real question marks about the resourcing of the implementation and a lot of concern, I think, within Whitehall as well as elsewhere, that reform is running into some serious implementational difficulty. But some of what lies underneath and behind universal credit does give rise to some considerable concern. And the overarching concern, I suppose, is a lot of it is being driven purely, solely by the quickest and easiest way to cut costs, rather than from that perspective of what do we want our welfare system to do and how do we ensure that we have a system that achieves all of that. And the concerns I have really straddle two key areas. One, fairness. I think some of the reforms, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute, some of these reforms are horribly unfair and are going to make life much more difficult for people who are already struggling with life already. But secondly, there's an economic impact to these reforms. they are taking, at a time when the economy is struggling to get back on its own feet and to grow again, they are taking a vast amount of money out of the economy, and I'll come back to that in a second. But let me just touch on some of the fairness issues. I want to really just illustrate this by citing a couple of examples of individuals who've come to see me as an MSP in my surgeries, just to illustrate what I'm talking about. You've heard a lot in the news recently about the bedroom tax, the introduction of an under-occupancy part of housing benefits, so that if you live in a house that has 2 bedrooms but you only are deemed to need 1 bedroom, then you lose some of your housing benefit. I recently had one guy come to my surgery. He brought with him, it was very sad, he brought with him the pile of job applications he'd filled in and sent away over the past few months. He'd recently been made redundant, been trying desperately hard to get back into work. He was separated from his wife, has 2 children, is living right now in a 2-bedroom housing association property, has his kids every weekend. Because he's deemed not to need the 2nd bedroom, has an enviable situation where he either has to find out of the meagre amount of money he's got every week another £20 to pay for the extra bedroom, or he's got to find somewhere else to go. The housing association doesn't have a 1-bedroom house to give him just now, so he's in this situation where he needs the bedroom, otherwise he'll lose the relationship he's got with his children, so he will find the money to pay for that, but as he says, well, I'm going to have my kids and I'll struggle to feed them for the weekend when I've got them, I certainly won't be able to take them anywhere. So that kind of situation, you can always attack welfare changes by finding the hard cases, but that's not an exception. He is one of many, many people with similar stories that have come to see me about these changes, and that is just, in my view, brutally unfair, a brutally unfair position to put somebody in. Similarly, people who are disabled or who have disabled children, who have thought that they had disability living allowance that allow them to provide a standard of living for their disabled relatives, who now find that that benefit may no longer be for life, because some of the people we're talking about, disabilities that are for life, that they now have to go through a pretty horrendous process of reassessment with all the stress that comes with that in order to know whether they can continue that benefit. So I could go on talking about these examples for a long, long time, but they illustrate some of the unfairness, and I think the lack of thought that's been given to some of these reforms. The second issue, of course, is the money that's been taken out of the economy. The coalition government has assessed that at £2.5 billion by 2015. We've looked at it a bit more closely, and we estimate that the money that will come out of pockets and come out of the economy is about £4.5 billion cumulatively by 2015. Now, everybody knows we've got a financial situation to deal with, that the country is in debt, and that we have to deal with that. But taking spending power out of the economy by taking money out of the pockets of the poorest in society actually holds back economic growth, because it's the poorest in society that are more likely to spend the resources they've got. They don't save, they don't put it aside, they spend. So you take that amount of money out, it is inevitably going to be a drag on the economy. We in the Scottish Government obviously have limited powers to deal with this, but we are doing what we can when we can, particularly trying to help through funds we set up to give advice agencies extra capacity to deal with the enormous increase in demand for advice and help and support that they are facing. We've set up a Scottish Welfare Fund which is designed to give crisis support to people who don't have anywhere else to turn, put some additional resources into that. We've taken a decision with local authorities not to pass on a cut to council tax benefit. The council tax benefit has been recently devolved to the Scottish Parliament, but the sting in the tail was that it came with a 10% cut. So at a time when some of the most vulnerable were being hit by all of these other changes, we with local authorities have decided not to pass on that 10% cut. We've found that resource from elsewhere. So we're having to find a great deal of resource within our devolved budget to try to mitigate some of the impact of these changes. It's also the case that although these are changes being driven by the Westminster Government, if if a disabled person is getting into difficulty because of benefit changes they have no control over, it's local authorities, it's the health service, it's the agencies that are under the responsibility of the devolved government that end up picking up the pieces of that, so that the impact is felt here, even although the decisions are not taken here. My last point really would be, what can we do differently? I want, put to one side the referendum, although, as I say, I'm happy to talk about that if you want, but regardless of independence or not, there is absolutely no doubt, in my view, that welfare should be decided here because of the relationship between local services, the health service, employability. It makes more sense. Constitutional politics aside, it makes so much more sense, or it would make so much more sense to be able to join up the decisions on welfare with the decisions on things we're already responsible for, about the services we put in place to support vulnerable people and help people into work. I think doing it that way, you can design a system that makes much more sense than the one we've got at the moment. We've currently got an expert group on welfare looking at some of the issues around transition to an independent welfare system. That's the road we go down, but also looking at what changes we might make in fairly short order to make the system fair, but also make it more rational than it is at the moment. So that's not that brief, but a reasonably brief account of welfare reform and our Scottish Government, our views on it. But I would be very happy to hear views, answer questions on this or any other topic.
No, thanks so much, Nicola. A model of clarity and concise as well.